ReleaseWire helps businesses connect with interested journalists and bloggers. Check out the link in the description to save 25% on your first press release.
Admiral, radar shows that we have liberals approaching at 3 o'clock, and libertarians at 9 o'clock, and conservatives at 6 o'clock. They're coming from every angle, every viewpoint. Oh, it's Political Radar with your hosts, Rhonda and Elliot.
Hey, all you political junkies, welcome to Political Radar, the best 30 minutes of unscripted and uncensored political talk you will hear all day. Episode 52, and we are Skyping today. This is very exciting. We've actually not done this before. I know you're rolling your eyes at me.
The rest of us have all done it before.
I'm a Skype virgin. I'm going to admit I am. It's all good. But we have to do this today because we have someone from St.
I think my grandma Skyped.
We have to do this. We have someone from St. Paul, Minnesota with us today, Kevin Pranis. He is the person that runs the organization. He's the organization director for LIUNA. Organizing. Okay.
I run the organizing program for LIUNA in Minnesota and North Dakota.
And LIUNA stands for, tell us.
The Laborers International Union of North America. We represent 500,000 construction and other, but mostly construction workers in the U.S. and Canada.
Okay, thank you. That was much better than my introduction of you. So thanks a lot. We appreciate you coming on and Skyping with us today. And so we could talk to you about something which is obviously out there in the news, very important, making big headlines. So you are involved in the Dakota Access Pipeline project. How did you find yourself involved in this?
Well, our organization, first of all, we represent construction workers who work in a wide variety of, construction occupations. We build buildings, big ones, small ones, infrastructure, highways, water and sewer. We work on solar energy installations, wind energy installations, natural gas, refineries. You name it, pretty much every type of construction we're involved in. And one of those areas, which is significant to our members, is pipeline construction, gas and oil pipelines primarily. And so we have worked across the country to really promote what we view as sensible pipeline projects that are beneficial to consumers and also to the economy. And I think in a way that we think is, beneficial or sort of neutral in terms of its environmental impact. The Dakota Access Pipeline is one that attracted our attention. It's the biggest project going in North Dakota right now. And we've been involved since the very beginning when it was first announced as a proposal. The open house meetings that were held in communities that were going to be impacted, the Public Service Commission hearings that were held for the permitting in North Dakota. Our members have been part of every phase of that process down to constructing the pipeline, which is almost completely built at this point.
Okay, so this is something that you've done before, obviously. You've been in projects
we've been
like this.
Involved in.
Okay.
Yes, we build pipelines all over the country. We've been active in permitting processes, in pipeline regulation. It's an important industry for our members.
Okay, so speaking to that, you said you've been getting from the process that's like from the start. You've been involved in this. There was, at one point they were going to build this north of Bismarck, North Dakota, and it was rerouted. Can you tell us what happened there? Because there's a lot out there that's, there's all kinds of different, conversations about the reason. What is the reason that you believe that happened?
I wish I could give you a authoritative answer. I mean, we weren't directly involved in that process of the routing. And my understanding, right?
But that's in North Dakota, right? I mean, that's in North Dakota. So that is part of the process of being in North Dakota.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So my understanding is that there's a whole number of factors, and this is in the dialogue that happens between the pipeline owner and the Army Corps of Engineers that looks at different routes. And when pipeline owners develop pipelines, they have pretty complex modeling software that they're putting in with many, many layers, right? They're looking at the question of how many people live near the route, what types of environmental resources are near the route, what are the distances, what are the elevations, what's the construction difficulty and sort of construction risks. And so a lot sort of gets plugged in there. And I think the Army Corps looks at similar factors, that can include, but the most common ones are environmental resources and populations and what existing infrastructure is adjacent there.
And water supplies, is water supply, is that a consideration?
Absolutely. Right.
Okay.
Absolutely. Right. So that water supplies are a consideration, water crossings, environmental impact, environmentally sensitive areas, and those critical considerations. And my understanding is there were a number of reasons that I think the Army Corps provided feedback suggesting that the moving it farther south was preferable, in terms of number of water crossings, the sort of in terms of how close you can make population centers. And to be honest, right, there is no place you can build a pipeline that has no risk, right, or that has no people who would be impacted in case of a spill. That's why it's so important to build and maintain and operate pipelines the right way to prevent those spills, because there isn't a good place for a spill. So what you're looking for often in the routing is what's the best balance, right? The most reasonable to mitigate risks, to make it efficient, to minimize the impacts of the construction process.
Yep, and this is a big project. So there's 500,000. There's a lot of oil that gets pushed through per day. It's like 500,000 barrels of oil that gets pushed through, correct?
Yeah,
it's a lot.
That's about that. Yes.
Okay.
It's a very significant project for an area that has really had a lack of infrastructure, takeaway infrastructure, to take a lack of what we would consider adequate takeaway infrastructure. It's not that the oil is not moving; it is. It's moving in trains that go through every major city and little town, from western North Dakota, from Bismarck all the way to Chicago.
So it's interesting though about that, because I was told that if they were to have gone with their original route, going north, there would have been over 11 different waterways they would have had to have crossed, and if they would have done it that way. This way they're going south. There's only really one permit they need. Is that true?
This isn't my area of expertise, but yes, I believe that there were fewer water crossings required on the route that was chosen.
Which is fewer permits, which is fewer community meetings, which is fewer outrage. Really, it's just essentially a lot less drama, correct? To just go south and do that.
Well, but I think more importantly, the fewer water crossings means, basically reduces your risk, right? The more times you have to cross water, obviously, the more places you have to be concerned about, because when oil ends up on land, it's relatively easier to clean up, right? Obviously, when oil is in water, it can be much more difficult. So you look to minimize the water crossings as much as possible. Both because of the difficulty, not so much because of hearings, because frankly, there were hearings that were statewide for all this. So there was no lack of publicity for this project. There were no lack of public hearings that were crowded rooms full of people that I personally attended and others of our members attended. They didn't avoid scrutiny on this project. What happened was that the folks who objected just didn't show up to any of those hearings.
So no, that's interesting that you say that, because that's not the story that I've been told, and that we had a guest on who actually has family there and is part of the tribe. And they said they actually were involved in some of these meetings, that they had issues with obviously the waterways, the sacred sites that are there.
Right.
Why is there such a discrepancy with yes, they were, no, they weren't?
Well,
can you clear that up?
My understanding is that there was some engagement. There was limited engagement with the Army Corps of Engineers. The Army Corps of Engineers has jurisdiction over small segments of the pipeline route that cross Army Corps land or that cross navigable waterways, like the Missouri River, like Lake Hawaii. So the main permitting process is a state-level process that each state conducts, and all 4 states the pipeline cross conducted a process through their public utility or public service commission to do the overall permitting for that pipeline. And that's the real permitting process for oil pipelines. It's not a federal process. It's a state process in each state. And there was no participation at all of the tribe. In fact, there was no mention, in my recollection, or anyone's who was there, of any of these concerns at any of those hearings. And it's really unfortunate, because a lot of landowners came to those hearings, and a lot of them had concerns. Some of them actually hired lawyers who filed as interveners and were given status as parties to the case. they had their concerns addressed, right? They were concerned about
was
reclamation.
What was the timeline for that? Were these hearings before or after things were moved around Bismarck?
So I think the hearings were after the route. I mean, my understanding is that the route that we're talking about that was north of Bismarck was a much earlier version of the proposal. So as far as I know, I mean, from the time that we've been, we're sort of aware and focused on it, the route was consistent, right? The route was, had been the same route for quite a while, and that's the route that was considered at the Public Service Commission.
And there's a lot of discussion, though, in the criticism of how the permits were acquired, that they were done in sections so that you could, I guess, avoid oversight and EPA regulations. What do you say about that?
The only way that you can believe that story is to completely ignore the state permitting process. I've seen these stories. I mean, it was remarkable to me. I think it was an LA Times story that talked about, well, no wonder nobody knew about the pipeline because it's only permitted in sections. That's a complete misunderstanding of how pipelines are permitted in the entire United States. Natural gas pipelines are permitted through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So there is a national process for natural gas pipelines, interstate pipelines. Oil pipelines are permitted by states. There is no overall federal oversight over that. The Army Corps only gets involved to the degree that you're crossing, basically areas where Army Corps has jurisdiction. But the reason there isn't a federal process is because there are state processes. So every single oil pipeline or hazardous liquids pipeline in North Dakota goes through an extensive review process with the Public Service Commission. It went through that in South Dakota, in Illinois, and in Iowa. There were all sorts of people involved in Iowa on both sides supporting and opposing the pipeline. So, and this process, right, you had hundreds of people who came out to hearings that the state organized. There was extensive media publicity before and after all of these hearings, right? So, and those hearings considered the entire project from from its beginning point in North Dakota all the way to the border in South Dakota, right? Looked at every aspect, looked at environmental aspects. There were, many 100-page files that were introduced that laid out the route, that laid out all the environmental issues, right? I mean, it's like a stack of paper as high as me is generated in the course of this, right? With all sorts of details about the project, and people who came to that process got changes made, right? Those people were able to get changes made to address their concerns because...
Was there ever a concern about the landslide, though? If there was like a portion of this land that, there would be a landslide. Yeah. Was there any material concerning that?
So there's always concern about the stability, and that's one of the questions that frequently comes up from the commissioners, right? Is how do you, what are you doing in terms of your construction techniques? How are you stabilizing, making sure that that's stabilized when you're putting in? Because I think it's absolutely a legitimate concern, but it's one of those that were addressed, and they have the engineers, produce their reports, but the commission staff and the commissioners, I think, ask a lot of questions. The other thing is, there's opportunity for anyone in the public to file to be an intervener, right? Any member of the public. We've done it. Many landowners did it, to file to be parties to that case. And as a party to the case, you're allowed to submit evidence. You're allowed to question witnesses on the record, to cross-examine the company's witnesses on the record, ask questions about their evidence. So,
what if you don't have the resources for that, though? Like, what if you literally are a group of people that don't have the know-how and the resources to do like what you're just saying right now? Because it seems like these people, it's not like their concerns are phantom. Right?
No, but I guess what I'd point out, first of all, the Public Service Commission has had individual landowners file as interveners and represent themselves. You're not required to have a lawyer. We've done it without a lawyer, right? We don't have a lot of money to spend on lawyers for this. We have fewer resources than Standing Rock does for something like this. And the truth is, there's no shortage of lawyers involved now, right, in trying to sue the federal government over this, right? And, I'm sure all sorts of money has been spent to do that. If anyone had shown up in this process, and we've talked to the commissioners and know them fairly well, they're all elected officials, right? They're all concerned about constituents' objections.
They're elected officials in North Dakota, though.
Yeah,
correct.
Right, but they're elected officials who are extreme. Like they're pro-development, right, in general, but they're anti-drama. Right? They really don't like, they don't like conflict. They look to resolve conflicts. They push companies very hard to, when someone comes to a hearing and says, I'm concerned that this place on my land isn't going to be safe. There are going to be water problems here. You won't be able to access it in the event of a spill. they require the company to produce evidence. Sometimes they, push the company, and the company makes changes because one farmer showed up and said, I don't think this is a good route. I have a better route in mind. So it is a remarkably open process in terms of public participation. Honestly, you need fewer resources to get involved in North Dakota than in most states, because a lot of states, it's very difficult. The process is much more sort of legalistic. It's much harder for an individual or a small organization to get involved and get heard. I can tell you from sitting through many Public Service Commission hearings, it is the easiest place for an individual citizen or organization to show up, to say their piece, and if they're interested, to become a part of that process.
Okay, so you said that there was issues with the landslide possibility, and you said they were addressed. What does that mean? How were they addressed? And how did you let these people know that, how did you handle that part of it?
Well, so this wasn't, again, our role was primarily to come in and talk about, what we saw as the benefits of this pipeline.
But you were there. You said you were in this process. You saw this happen. So
yeah.
Did you see that these people actually had that issue addressed? Do you know that they had that addressed?
Which people had?
Okay, you said with the landslide. The fact that yes, that's a risk, having a landslide and having the pipe. The pipeline is not designed to handle that. Is that fair? Is that a fair statement?
Well, I guess it depends on. It depends on the nature of the landslide, right? What I can speak to is that there were questions. The commissioners regularly asked, not only of this pipeline but other pipelines, questions about when they're going through, the hilly areas, right, that are subject to erosion. What the plans are for doing construction.
And it's pretty hilly out there. I'm originally from North Dakota, so I've been through this area. Yep. It's very hilly, so it's very likely there could be a landslide, right?
There's landslide. Well, there's landslides all the time. The question is whether you're talking about, a landslide sufficient to, to completely uncover and damage the pipe. And I think the assessment, the assessment of the engineers, obviously, the pipeline company has as much interest as anyone, maybe more, right, in avoiding their pipe being exposed in a situation like that. So I think.
But it's possible. But it is possible that could actually happen, and that there could be oil in the water. That is their problem. That is their issue, and that's why they've been camping out there since August. That is the problem. That's why they're still there. That and the sacred sites that, they're worried about, being affected. What about that? Like, how do you deal with that?
So, in terms of the sacred sites, look, I haven't been there, and I'm not an expert in this. I regularly see completely conflicting testimony, right, from the State Preservation Office, which had been and done multiple surveys. I guess Mike, what I would go back to is, I think it would have been wise to participate fully earlier in the process, because a lot of those issues can be resolved. I think that the pipeline company, we know of at least one case where the pipeline company did stop work. Right. And this is not unusual, right? There are all sorts of places, including places that no one had identified as a likely site of a find. You may find some remains. You may find just an arrowhead, right? Finding an arrowhead is enough to completely stop construction on a project. And if you ask any of our pipeliners, most of them have been at some pipeline project somewhere in the country where they've found something like that and work has come to a halt. Right?
I think it's actually one of the things, though, I think that they had expressed and that they were concerned about, and our guest had shared with us, was the treaty that had been put out, the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the treaty that was out there that was supposed to protect the land in the first place. And I think when these people did go forward and they were part of these meetings, they figured that this treaty itself would protect them, and they were wrong. And how are people getting around that exactly? Because that's a constitutional issue as well.
Sure. That's a question. I'm not the legal expert. That's a question for the courts. And we've never argued that this pipeline should move forward illegally. So far, all of the court decisions have favored the company, that it went through the appropriate process, that all this was approved. What I guess my point would be: have there been a lot of
hang on, this got to back that up. Have there actually been a lot of court hearings about this piece of the pipeline?
About which piece? The lake crossing?
You said the court hearings have shown that this was not being done illegally. Have there been?
What I'm saying is, well, there was a federal court decision, and there was an appeals court decision, right? 2 attempts by opponents of the pipeline to block the pipeline, and both of those, were to date unsuccessful, right? And so, And the judges made those decisions knowing that the pipeline construction was happening. That is, so the judges are deciding basically, we don't believe there's enough of a case to justify stopping construction of this pipeline, right? Because it is unlikely, effectively, that they're going to succeed on the merits in this case. And so what's unfortunate here is that I think all this could have been prevented, right? The company has every interest in not having this kind of conflict. The public has every interest. The Public Service Commission has every interest in trying to make sure that if there are sacred sites, that those can be avoided.
So,
right? Which is possible to do. Reroutes happen all the time, precisely to do that. I think the part of the problem is, first of all, there was a lack of participation in the process, in much of the process, including part of the Army Corps process, where the tribe, canceled meetings with the Army Corps. It was, if they had done what I think the tribes had done in Minnesota, which is stay actively engaged from the beginning. In Minnesota, there's a pipeline that never happened, still hasn't happened, because the tribes basically did their job, were active, in the process from the beginning. No different position than Standing Rock, but they didn't wait until the pipeline was half built to suddenly say this is, this can't happen, it has to be stopped, right? At which point it was already legally permitted. There was no way to sort of draw a magic marker on the map and draw a new route, right? That's not even legally permissible to do at that point. And so, it became an impossible situation, which has been frustrating to everyone in North Dakota. It said, look, if you wanted to work on avoiding sites, and the other point that I'd make about this is there are very different ideas about what is the problem with Dakota Access. So is the problem with Dakota Access where it crosses the river, that it crosses any river at all? Is it where it's being routed, on what, the tribe believes are sacred sites? Or is it that there shouldn't be any kind of pipeline moving oil because all of it should stay in the ground?
Well, and it's half a mile away from their water supply. Isn't that a problem? It's half a mile away. It's half a mile away from their water supply.
That's what. So you're aware, right, that water supply is about to move, some 20, 30 miles downstream, was already planned to be moved 20, 30 miles downstream. So it won't be. So within about a year, it won't be 2 miles away from their water supply.
And who was moving that?
The tribe was. This has been planned for years to move their water intake long before the pipeline.
Where would we find that information? Where would we find that information?
So there's been reporting in the North Dakota Press has done good reporting, balanced reporting, I think, on the protests, and you can certainly find that in the North Dakota Press.
Because that's information. That's really interesting information. I would love to have that information.
Yeah, so I'd be happy to send. I could send you that. I can send you an email information about that. But that water intake is moving downstream, and significantly downstream. Now, again, there's no good place to have an oil spill, which is why it's important. The other thing to keep in mind is that we're not talking about a pipe that's going to be laid at the bottom of the river, right? We're talking about a pipe that's going to be many, many feet underground, where you're going through rock and clay. And so part of the reason for doing directional drilling instead of what people used to do, which is just lay a pipe at the bottom of a river, those pipes are extraordinarily exposed to erosion, right? And eventually, sooner or later, there's a great risk, even if it's buried, that's going to get uncovered, right? When you lay it and when you trench it into the riverbed. When you're talking about drilling it many, many feet below the riverbed, you're talking about a much lower risk, both of it being damaged and of a resulting spill ever making it to the water. And that's the objective of the way that you build this.
Okay, why wouldn't you reroute it though? Why would we not do that now? With everything you said, they wanted to avoid drama. Well, boy, they sure have it now. Why would you not reroute it? Because people are thinking that it's actually because I think some of the conversation, the criticism is that, the oil prices are dropping, and that, the value is changing. And then after January, that things are going to shift a little bit, and there wouldn't be as much of a profit on this. So why would you not, why would whoever's its decision is up to, why would they not do that at this point? It can be rerouted, correct? It can happen. It's not impossible. This project can finish.
But how would it be rerouted?
That's what I'm asking you. Is it impossible to reroute this? Is it something that could never happen? Could this project be finished with it being rerouted? Because I feel like that they're asking for that to happen.
If the president had a power and the Army Corps had the power to basically take a map and the proposed map and just draw a new line that said, okay, we're going to bring it, we'll put it 15 miles, away instead of 2 miles. We'll put it 20, 30 miles away. It has to cross the river, right? I mean, otherwise you can't get where you're trying to go without crossing the river. And downstream, you're talking about going through all the way to Nebraska, I think, to get on the other side. But let's say it goes back north or even crosses north of Bismarck, right, which was one of the original proposals. You move it back there. The problem is if, my understanding of the law is that if the Army Corps came back and said, well, you know what, we're going to make you do it north of Bismarck, there'd be costs and sort of drama for the company. But more importantly, there's a review process. There's an extensive review process that the Army Corps went through for the route that was approved. They'd have to go through that exact same review process. So you're talking about a year and a half, right? And a year and a half during which most of the people who oppose this pipeline would be opposing the other proposed route, right? Because keep in mind, most of the people opposing this pipeline wouldn't be happy with a 10 or a 15 or a 20 mile or a north of Bismarck route crossing. Don't think any pipeline should exist at all. So you'd be telling the company, well, why don't you take a year and a half delay, during which time you will be fought and sued every step of the way, right, to prevent you from being able to build this pipeline by 90% of all the people who are opposing you right now.
But if that was actually true, then we wouldn't see all of the pipelines that are currently, that keep you in business and that we see in the country. If that was the case and you were doing it in that context, like where they moved it, a certain amount of feet away and changed that I'm not necessarily.
But you can do that during routing. That could have been this all could have been done when it's in permitting. But I don't know of any situation in which a pipeline has been permitted, right? And then in the middle of construction, people said, "Hey, just kidding. I know we told you we could build it here, but actually we have a different idea in mind." It would be equivalent to your starting to build a house, right, and getting all the zoning. You buy the land, you pay for the materials, you pay the contractor, you are halfway through building a house, and suddenly some neighbors decide that they would like it to be, they only want to give you one story instead of two, and they go and chain themselves to the bulldozers, and you're stuck in the middle of building your house. They say, well, you can go through another process. You could apply for an 18 months, for a new building permit. In the meantime, all your money's tied up in this. You've already sold your other house. You're expecting to live in this house, right? I mean, if the tribe had come to the table at the right time, I think most of this stuff likely would have been solved in a way that would have, I think, met the tribe's needs, even if it didn't meet all the needs of the climate activists who don't believe there should be a pipeline.
So they didn't.
Would have been met.
Was the tribe not involved early, or were they?
They weren't involved, and they literally were not involved in any part of the public service, the commission process, which is the permitting process for the pipeline. They weren't involved in any aspect of it.
So you said that it was really well publicized. So what's the publicization process? How do things?
So there were stories in the paper. I mean, this was a big project, so it got a lot of attention as a big project.
We know what it's like when a local newspaper handles corporate advertising and allows for it. Trust me, we fought a corporation in this
wasn't
area.
This wasn't a local story though, so it had a lot of critical. Not only was there public, there.
But you actually said the North Dakota press actually had a lot out there, and that was what was out there. Well,
yeah.
that's local. That's local news.
That's not no. This is the Bismarck Tribune and the Fargo Forum, right? And the Fargo Forum is the people in Fargo who. We're talking they live 3 hours away from the nearest place where the pipeline was going to come, and they could care less about a pipeline, right? So the biggest papers aren't papers that have an oil interest particularly. I mean, they have a North Dakota perspective on business, et cetera. But not only that, there was all sorts of critical publicity that was going on. There were, complaints from landowners in Iowa. There were complaints from landowners in North Dakota who weren't happy with the company's landmen.
Did anyone actually reach out to the Sioux in Standing Rock? Did anyone ever reach out? Because I know you referenced, people coming in your home, you're building a home, and then people come in and, they chain themselves to your house. But that doesn't happen if you're a good neighbor. So were they a good neighbor? Did someone think maybe, there's a treaty involved, there's a reservation involved, there are people that have a water supply. Did anyone actually go to them and address that? We're about to come through here with something pretty major. Did anyone do that? Were they good neighbors?
So I don't know anything about the dealings that the company had with the tribe, and they could respectively speak to that. None
of that was discussed at these meetings, though. None of this was discussed at these meetings that you were at.
No, but the meetings are for the interested parties. So the Public Service Commission doesn't tell people that they should be at the hearings. These are public hearings, much like if you were going to, if you were going to cite something in your neighborhood and there was a planning commission says, okay, we're going to have a meeting on this proposed development, a proposed development that's been extensively publicized, that's actually been controversial in the newspaper. And if you didn't show up to any of those planning meetings, right, couldn't be bothered, but then showed up in the middle of construction and said, I can't believe that this project is being allowed to be built near me. I don't want a bar near me. This is ridiculous.
This happens all the time, though. It happens sometimes when people want to move a cell tower. When people are in locally, if people want to build, an apartment complex, this happens. The lines of communication can be crossed. But now they're clearly not. And these people, the lines of communication are crossed, but they're clearly not. And these people are there. And they feel very strongly with what they're saying. And they have treaties to back them up. So why isn't there a possibility of this being rerouted?
But the problem with the reroute, there was a possibility of it being rerouted if the people who are motivated now had been motivated then. The problem is now.
So it's too late. It's too late to reroute it. So it's impossible. They have to do it there. There's no way to reroute this. Now that these people are there, they feel strongly. There's no way you can reroute this. Is that what you're saying?
Who would pay? Well, I guess.
So it's a money thing. It's a money thing.
Pay for this. Well, it's not just a money thing. It's also a question of, you get a permit, you go through a permit process. All these issues are supposed to be sussed out in the permit process. Once you get your permit, you're allowed to do what your permit allows you to do, right? Mm-hmm. And the fact that somebody who didn't show up during the permit process then doesn't
we know how permits work. You can reapply for a permit. You can reapply. You can reapply for a permit.
So, but at 18, but the company can't. I mean, nobody could build anything. Basically, and that's partly why there's a sort of basic rule of law function, right? No one could build anything. So let's say it's not a pipeline. Let's say that somebody wants to build a shopping mall, or they want to build an apartment building, right? Mm-hmm. And if they build an apartment building, they go through the permitting process. There are community meetings. There are boxes they need to check. They check those boxes. They get their permits. They're halfway through construction. And then somebody says, well, you know what, I don't like that apartment building. You need to shut down construction of that apartment building, right, for 18 months and reapply for the permits because we changed our minds on that. No one would put money into building an apartment building. No one would put money into building anything, right, if they knew that their permits, that is, if few protesters could show up halfway through, and then the government would say, well, you know what, we told you could do this, and you made all your plans, you borrowed your money, you mobilized your people, you hired contractors, right? You basically staked everything on this because we told you could do it, but we changed our mind. So a world like that, it not only doesn't work for pipelines, it doesn't work for solar developers, it doesn't work for wind developers, it doesn't work for people who build natural gas plants, it doesn't work for people who build apartment buildings, right? Anyone who puts private money into building things can't afford to build things if they can get all the permits and then have all the permits taken.
But if I look at this diagram of the United States and I look at the amount of pipelines that run through, it's really hard to hear what you're saying and swallow that because there's a lot out there. There's a lot of oil moving through this country now.
Yeah.
Okay, so what would 18 months, what would that do? Exactly. To our oil issue, our oil, our love of oil. What would that do to that?
Well, so the issue isn't the oil. So for me, what 18 months means, I live in St. Paul. I live, maybe a mile and a half away from rail tracks. I watched for years while rail cars full of Bakken crude, which is, on the more flammable end of crude, went through in my neighborhood, through all kinds of neighborhoods. I'm sure you're probably familiar with what happened in Quebec, right? 47 people died in a fiery inferno. This is not, this country has never moved that much oil by rail. It is not safe, nor are the rails set up to do that. They were never set up to move the kind of volumes of crude, right? And so we're lucky. I mean, there have been a dozen probably fiery derailments in the past several years. We're just lucky that only one of them resulted in many people being killed. This could be downtown Minneapolis, right by the ballpark. It could be the Wayzata High School. It could be, in sort of like in Milwaukee or in Chicago, that one of those trains derails and you have incredible amount of destruction and loss of life. So that's just not a good way to move oil.
It's not a good way to live in general because our dependence on fossil fuels plays a part in that as well. Maybe we shouldn't actually be fixated on that. Maybe we don't need to add more pipelines. Maybe we'd actually need to do more solar. I mean, you said that's something you do as well.
Okay, hippie.
It's true. No, I'm sorry. I mean, death and destruction by train. How about we take some of this and we invest in doing some green energy? I mean, looks at that diagram, you see a lot of oil pipelines moving through this country now.
Who's we? There's a company that's building a pipeline. They're doing a pipeline. They're not going to do solar. I'm
not asking them to do solar. I'm just saying in general. I mean, looking at the diagram, we have a lot of oil moving through this country. I'm not buying the fact that we can't wait 18 months to reroute it. Someone might lose a few dollars. Oh no. And there's oil. It's not like we don't have it. I guess that's what I'm trying to understand. You know, I know that's what you're saying, and I know that's what you're supposed to do, and that's your job. But I guess when you look at the facts, there's a lot of oil moving. Things have been rerouted. They have the money. We know this.
No, yeah. Well, I'd be interested to find one example of a project that was substantially rerouted during construction. I'd love to see one example.
If there's ever been a time to do it, this would be the time.
So that comes to my last question. And what do you feel personally? You know, maybe you're not speaking for the company or for the union or anything, but how do you think we move forward from this?
I think that there's a couple of ways we can do that. Certainly in the permitting process, it's important for people to understand that process and be involved where they have concerns to get those addressed. And the idea of improving consultation with tribes, which is being discussed at the federal level, makes sense. I also think that there's a lot we can do to prevent spills, and that at least those of us concerned about spills, right, which is not everyone opposing this pipeline, but those who really want clean water, clean land, should focus on working together to prevent spills. And in fact, no one, to my knowledge, has done more than our organization in North Dakota to try to increase regulation on pipeline construction, to prevent spills, and to challenge some of the actors that have been responsible for problems in North Dakota and hold them accountable. And I think, unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot of the folks who've made a lot of noise about Dakota Access anywhere around other efforts to actually keep in North Dakota clean and prevent spills in North Dakota.
So what are you doing to get that word out? Because I think, sometimes, again, if you're relying on a newspaper out of Bismarck or Dickinson or Minot or any of these areas, I mean, it's very rural. I know that area very well. What are you planning to do?
You'd be really surprised. I'll send you some articles. There's been fantastic coverage of these issues in the local press, of the problems with the industry, and as well as of Dakota Access. And unfortunately, I think very little of that's being read by people who are reading about Dakota Access or reading about North Dakota.
I have friends there. I've seen a lot of that. So what are you doing as far as you said you would like people to help maybe with prevent spills. That's something I think you could do. You could be a little bit louder on that, and maybe get that word out a little bit more. Because I'm sure this won't be the last pipeline you build, right?
No, absolutely not. And for example, the state had no regulations on gathering pipelines. Basically, they were almost completely unregulated. That's where most of the problems were and most of the spills. We've been highlighting awareness of that. We've been getting in the news, right, with raising the problems of these spills. We helped work with other organizations, supporting regulations that are finally going to create construction standards. And hopefully those will take effect January 1st. And we actually had 200 workers on the Dakota Access Pipeline sign an open letter to state officials saying, look, we need every pipeline to be built at this same standard. And we need to make sure that our industry isn't suffering because of mistakes made by contractors that are frankly not doing it right. And, we think that was helpful in getting the state to move forward. So, that's certainly a priority for us, is making sure pipelines don't spill.
But we have to make sure that EPA regulation and regulation in general is enforced, which doesn't make me feel too great knowing the government officials who don't buy into regulation, who don't want regulation. So, that would have to happen first, obviously. So we need to rely on regulation to control the spills, is what you're saying. Really, that's what it is.
Well, regulations. Well, no, there's two parts to it. I mean, part of our effort has been on regulation. The other part has been looking to investors and the owners of these companies, making them aware of the challenges, aware of what's happening on the ground and in the C-suites. And we've actually had some success there, getting companies to recognize that maybe there were problems they weren't aware of on the ground, right? That they're not seeing what the foremen are doing, what the superintendents are doing, what the contractors are doing on the ground. And there's a lot that investors can do to look more closely at where their money's going and make sure that it's going into the right kind of assets that are both good long-term investments and that don't pose the kind of environmental and safety risks, that have been a challenge in North Dakota. So we have to both work on the company and investor level and work on the regulatory level.
And then just the people who, like the Standing Rock, the Sioux tribe, who don't have a lot of resources like everyone you just mentioned. Let's hope that something actually happens for them that will help them out. That's what I'm hopeful, and that's my closing statement. What is yours?
Well, we also hope to be able to work with Standing Rock, because when everybody else goes home, and remembering that the vast majority of the demonstrators aren't from North Dakota, don't live there, and won't be staying there. When everybody else goes home, we're still going to be there. Standing Rock's still going to be there. We all have to find a way to work together to build the kind of state that we all want.
Awesome. That's great information. Kevin, if anybody would like to contact you or your organization for any follow-up information, what's a good place to reach you?
Sure. So I should look at my office number. I always use my.
Or if there's a website or anything like that.
Actually, the best thing is www.LIUNA, LIUNA, NorthDakota.org. You can see information about that. And if you want to know about efforts on pipeline construction and pipeline safety, there's a website, buildbetternd.org, that also features a lot of the evidence that we've gathered of some of the challenges and some of the solutions to those challenges in North Dakota that we would encourage people to look to.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You can reach me at Elliot on Twitter, Elliot C on Facebook. That wraps up Political Radar, episode number 52. If you'd like to get some show notes on the episode, you can go to politicalradar.com/52 and get involved with the Facebook group, Political Radar Community on Facebook. And
you can get in touch with me on Twitter at Sitnicow, and I'm on Facebook as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kevin, for being on.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it.
We're all out.
All right.
We can let you get back to work.
Have a good day. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too.
If you enjoyed this episode of Political Radar, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter. Even better, submit a show review to iTunes or Stitcher. To listen to other episodes of Political Radar, please visit politicalradar.com/episodes. To support our podcast, please visit our sponsors who make the show possible. You can do this by visiting politicalradar.com/sponsors.
Thanks for listening to Political Radar. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe on iTunes or your favorite podcast app. To stay up to date, visit politicalradar.com or connect with us on Facebook or Twitter.
Political Radar is a proud member of the Newsmakers Podcast Network, an ever-growing network of podcasts covering a wide range of topics. Check them out at npcn.tv.